Scum like you has no business in a house of justice. The words came out of Officer Richard Kane's mouth like venom, moments before his palm cracked across Cassandra Miller's face on the marble steps of the federal courthouse. Her leather briefcase flew from her hand, scattering official case files and judicial orders across the stone like shattered evidence. The bronze plaque above them read, "The Honorable Judge Cassandra Miller, presiding." But Kane was too blinded by his prejudice to notice the irony of assaulting the very judge whose name was carved into the building behind him. The morning sun stretched long beams across the marble steps of the federal courthouse, gleaming off polished brass railings and the glass facade that reflected the restless city beyond. Commuters hustled past, briefcases swinging, shoes clicking against the stone, none of them noticing that history was about to pivot right here on these steps. Judge Cassandra Miller walked with the calm stride of a woman who had done this thousands of times. Civilian clothes, dark blazer, navy skirt, flats instead of her usual pumps. In her hand, a leather briefcase heavy with files, orders she had signed, motions she had reviewed, notes she had prepared for the day's docket. Each document represented lives that would be altered by her judgment. She carried them like a soldier carried weapons, with precision and respect. But Richard Kane didn't see any of that. At 6'2" and built like a linebacker gone soft, Officer Kane leaned out from behind a concrete pillar, eyes narrowing as he tracked her approach. The badge on his chest caught a glint of light. He'd learned to wield both his size and his authority like blunt instruments, and he relished the fear they drew. 12 years in uniform had taught him a grim lesson. Intimidation often got quicker results than actual police work. Well, he muttered under his breath, lips curling as he stepped into her path. What do we have here? His boots scraped deliberately against the stone as he positioned himself squarely in front of Cassandra, blocking her way up the steps. He looked at her briefcase with contempt, not curiosity. This ain't no welfare office, sweetheart. You lost? Or just out here looking for trouble? Cassandra slowed, shoulders squaring as she adjusted her grip on the handle. She had weathered outbursts, threats, manipulations from hardened criminals for more than 2 decades on the bench. She had faced cartel defendants, corrupt politicians, broken men with nothing left to lose. Yet something about this was different. This wasn't just hostility. It was raw hatred hiding behind the shield of law enforcement. "Excuse me, officer," she said, voice steady but edged with vigilance. "I'm here on official business. If you'd like, I can present my identification." Kane cut her off with a harsh laugh, the kind that scraped against nerves. "Lady, the only business you got here is the kind that lands you in cuffs. This is federal property, not some community center you can waltz into with your fake paperwork and sob stories." His voice carried the swagger of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. Over a dozen years, he had learned that in this building, his word weighed heavier than anyone else's. 2 other uniforms drifted over, drawn like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Officer Mark Reynolds, a stocky veteran with a phone already out, recording with a smirk, and Officer Kyle Mercer, younger, eager to prove himself, eyes lit with cruel amusement. "She thinks she belongs here." "Kane," Reynolds called, his voice carrying a sneer. "These people never learn." Cassandra stood her ground. The weight of centuries of systemic prejudice pressed invisible hands against her shoulders, but she refused to bend. "Officer, I am telling you clearly, I have legitimate business in this courthouse." "Official business," Kane repeated, rolling the words around his mouth like poison. He leaned closer, breath sour with coffee and disdain. "Let me guess. Lawyer, judge, maybe even a senator." His grin widened. "That's what they all claim when they get caught somewhere they don't belong." The tension between them thickened, the courthouse looming like a silent witness. Cassandra tightened her jaw, gaze flicking briefly toward the bronze plaque mounted 20 feet above them. The inscription read, "United States District Court, the Honorable Judge Cassandra Miller presiding." The irony was nearly suffocating, But Kane didn't look up. He saw only what his prejudice allowed. "The only credentials you need," he snarled, shoving his face closer, "are an arrest record, and you're about to get one." Before she could respond, his open palm whipped across her face. The slap cracked against her cheek with brutal force, sending her briefcase tumbling. Files burst open, scattering across the marble steps like fallen leaves. Judicial orders stamped with her seal, motions bearing her signature, confidential memoranda she had personally written. The sound echoed off the stone walls, a sound that would later haunt Richard Kane's nightmares. Gasps rose from pedestrians down the block. Reynolds's phone caught every angle, his chuckle audible on the recording. Mercer kicked at one of the papers, laughing. "Look at this fake crap. They're getting creative these days." Cassandra's head snapped sideways, pain blooming along her jaw. Her hand twitched reflexively toward the scattered papers. But Kane's hand was faster. Thick fingers clamped around her throat, pinning her against the cold stone wall. "Scum like you has no business in a house of justice," he hissed, spit flying, his voice shaking with venom. "Time you learned to respect law and order." Metal bit into her wrists as he yanked her arms behind her back. The cuffs ratcheted tight, circulation numbing her hands. From somewhere deep inside her chest, a calm voice, honed through 23 years of judicial composure, reminded her, "Remember everything, every word, every face. This will matter." The bronze plaque above glittered silently, unseen by the man committing the worst mistake of his life beneath it. As Kane dragged her up the courthouse steps, Cassandra kept her chin level despite the swelling ache in her jaw. Each face that laughed, each sneer thrown her way, she etched into memory with surgical precision. Inside, the air was cooler but no less suffocating. Security guards nodded toward Kane in approval, blind to the grotesque inversion playing out before them. Court clerks stepped aside deferentially, as though he were delivering justice rather than desecrating it. "Another one for processing," Kane announced proudly at the intake desk, chest swelling with borrowed authority. "Attempted breach of courthouse security, resisting arrest, assault on an officer." The desk sergeant barely looked up. After years of Kane's steady stream of arrests, it was just another day, another body in the system. "What's the story this time?" "Suspicious activity at the entrance," Kane said, words flowing like oil, practiced and slick. "Carrying forged legal documents, claimed she had business inside but refused ID, became combative, had to use minimal force to subdue." The lies came easy. He had rehearsed them in dozens of reports, each fabrication layered to feed prosecutors exactly what they expected to hear. Cassandra sat silently on a metal bench nearby, hands cuffed too tight, circulation throbbing in her fingertips. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair disheveled from the assault, but her mind remained crystalline. Constitutional violations stacked in her thoughts like dominoes. Unlawful detention, excessive force, perjury in progress. She thought of Terry v. Ohio, of Miranda v. Arizona, of Brady v. Maryland, precedents she had cited in countless rulings now wrapped around her like armor. She had presided over thousands of cases of misconduct. She had handed down sentences to corrupt officers, fraudulent witnesses, arrogant officials, but never had she felt the machinery of injustice grinding against her own body, shackling her wrists, dismissing her identity. The irony was unbearable. Just 15 feet from her own courtroom, her bench, her seal, she sat in chains while officers chuckled over their latest win. And yet, deep beneath the sting of humiliation, a different sensation stirred. Resolve. Kane thought he had humiliated another faceless target. What he had actually done was place himself, Reynolds, Mercer, and an entire department into the crosshairs of federal accountability. Because Cassandra Miller was not just another suspect, she was the federal judge who had signed their warrants, reviewed their cases, and wielded authority they couldn't begin to fathom. And now, she would wield it against them. The hunter had no idea he had just become the prey. The holding cell was a steel box, no windows, only a flickering light above, and the smell of disinfectant clinging to the concrete. Cassandra sat on the cold bench, wrists raw from the cuffs. She adjusted her breathing, forcing her body into stillness even as adrenaline clawed at her veins. Through the bars, she could hear Kane's booming voice, the easy swagger of a man who had rehearsed this part too many times. His words dripped like oil onto paper as he dictated his report to the prosecutor on duty. Subject approached courthouse at approximately 8:45. Ma'am, he recited. Suspicious behavior consistent with attempted security breach. Carried what appeared to be fraudulent legal documents. Dressed inappropriately for legitimate business. Became combative when questioned. Prosecutor Laura Bennett, mid-40s. Precise in speech and manner. Scribbled notes without raising her head. She had worked with Kane for years, and his cases always came wrapped in neat bows. Credible officer testimony, cooperative evidence, quick convictions. It made her life easier. She had no reason to doubt him. What exactly did she say to you? Bennett asked. Kane barely paused. Typical evasive stuff. Claimed I'd regret stopping her. Didn't know who I was dealing with. Threats. Aggressive tone. When I attempted to de-escalate, she swung at me. I had to restrain her for safety. The lies came smoothly, as though pulled from a manual. Reynolds and Mercer chimed in to corroborate, adding layers to the fiction. Their confidence was absolute. They believed the system would always side with their uniforms. Inside the cell, Cassandra closed her eyes. Each word was a thread in the noose they were tightening around themselves. Perjury under oath. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights. She let them talk, knowing the court stenographer would capture every syllable. Her phone, confiscated during intake, had already served its purpose. In those precious minutes between arrest and booking, she had managed 2 calls. The first to Chief Judge Eleanor Brooks, instructing her to preserve all courthouse surveillance immediately. The second to the FBI Civil Rights Division, formally requesting an emergency investigation. The machinery was already turning. Kane didn't even know it. By mid-morning, the makeshift courtroom buzzed with low chatter. Judge Stephen Holloway, filling in for the absent Judge Miller, ironically the very woman sitting cuffed at the defense table, adjusted his glasses as he scanned the docket. To him, this was routine. Another trespasser. Another attempted fraud. Case number 2025, CR 8821, the clerk droned. The State versus Jane Doe. Cassandra's jaw tightened. Jane Doe. Kane had deliberately stripped her of identity, reducing her to an anonymous placeholder. It was meant to humiliate, to erase her standing before the system she embodied. Officer Richard Kane, Bennett called, gesturing him to the witness stand. Kane walked with chest puffed, uniform pressed sharp, badge glinting. His very posture was performance, the seasoned professional ready to defend justice. Tell the court what you observed this morning, Bennett prompted. Your Honor, Kane began smoothly. At approximately 8:45, I noticed the defendant loitering near the courthouse entrance in a suspicious manner. She carried a briefcase inconsistent with her apparent socioeconomic status. When I questioned her, she became hostile, refused identification, and attempted to push past me. I was forced to use minimal force to maintain security. Every detail was a weapon, every lie carefully calibrated to feed the judge's preconceptions. From the defense table, Cassandra sat upright, hands folded despite the cuffs. The bruise along her cheekbone was visible, stark evidence of Kane's brutality, yet he reframed it seamlessly as a defensive maneuver. Did the defendant strike you, Officer Kane? Bennett asked. Yes, ma'am. She swung at me, tried to kick when I restrained her. I showed restraint, used only what was necessary. And in the gallery, Reynolds and Mercer exchanged satisfied looks. already rehearsing their own supporting testimony. Judge Holloway nodded gravely, buying into the narrative without hesitation. Proceed. Reynolds took the stand next, swearing an oath with false solemnity. I observed everything from about 50 feet. Officer Kane handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. The defendant was erratic, confrontational, and tried to force entry. Then Mercer, Your Honor, the documents she carried contained sensitive case information no ordinary citizen would possess. Highly suspicious, strong indication of forgery. Each layer of perjury stacked higher. A fragile tower of lies wobbling above a foundation Cassandra knew would soon collapse. When Bennett finally rested the state's case, confidence radiated from her like heat. The room seemed convinced. Another open and shut matter. Another criminal off the streets. But then Judge Holloway turned to the defendant. Miss Doe, he said, his tone dripping with disinterest. Do you wish to make a statement? Cassandra rose slowly, the chains clinking, but her posture radiated authority, not submission. A hush fell across the room. Something about her presence didn't fit the role she had been assigned. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, voice calm, words measured. I would like to clarify several inaccuracies in the testimony we've just heard. Her diction was precise, her tone unmistakably professional, not the frantic protest of a cornered suspect, but the cadence of someone who had lived inside courtrooms for decades. She cited Haig Veory, CIO, regarding public access to sidewalks. She dissected Kane's claims, pointing out contradictions, invoking constitutional provisions with ease. She requested preservation of video evidence, referencing federal rules of evidence. Rule 106. Each legal reference landed like a thunderclap in the silent chamber. Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Bennett stiffened. Kane's smug smile faltered, and Cassandra kept going, each word tightening the snare. I have in my possession, she said finally, reaching carefully into her blazer pocket, official credentials that will establish my identity beyond dispute, credentials I attempted to present before being assaulted. She pulled out her judicial ID wallet. Even from across the room, the golden federal seal was visible. The air went electric. Bailiff Thomas Grant, who had served this courthouse for 15 years, froze mid-step, recognition dawning on his face like a sunrise over storm clouds. Your Honor, Cassandra said evenly, I believe there has been a grave misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Kane arrested this morning. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Kane's face drained of color. Reynolds and Mercer stiffened, panic creeping into their eyes. Judge Holloway blinked, his voice faltering. Court will recess for 15 minutes. The gavel fell, but the sound was more like a thunderclap, signaling the storm had only just begun. In the recess chamber, the atmosphere shifted like the eye of a hurricane. Bailiff Thomas Grant moved with trembling urgency, hands fumbling as he carried a garment bag and a wooden case. His face was pale, his voice hoarse. Your robes, Judge Miller, and your ceremonial gavel. Cassandra unzipped the bag with deliberate calm. The black robe slid over her shoulders, its familiar weight settling like armor. For 23 years, she had worn it as a symbol of duty. Today had it felt sharper, like a blade. She opened the wooden box, lifted the polished gavel, and ran her fingers over the engraved words. Justice is blind, but she sees all. The bruise on her cheek throbbed, but it no longer signified humiliation. It was evidence. It was fuel. Grant, she said, adjusting the robe's gold trim. When we return, announce me with full protocol. Yes, Your Honor. His voice cracked but held steady. Out in the main courtroom, murmurs swelled. Officers whispered in corners. Prosecutor Laura Bennett frantically scrolled through her phone, whispering into hurried calls. Judge Stephen Holloway shuffled papers, desperate to avoid the truth pressing against the chamber walls. When the doors opened and Cassandra emerged, the room fell silent. She walked with measured dignity, robe flowing, gavel in hand, Every step reclaimed the ground Kane thought he had taken. "All rise," Bailiff Grant thundered, his voice echoing off marble and wood. "The Honorable Judge Cassandra Miller, presiding." The gallery rose as one. Holloway scrambled from the bench, nearly tripping in his haste. Bennett's jaw slackened. Reynolds and Mercer looked like men awaiting execution. And Richard Kane, his face had gone the color of chalk, sweat rolling down his temples as the realization hit like a freight train. Cassandra ascended to her rightful seat, the bench, her bench. She sat slowly, deliberately, eyes sweeping across the chamber like floodlights exposing rot. "Officer Kane," she said, voice even but heavy with authority, "you may remain standing." Kane wavered on his feet, his knees buckled slightly. "Approximately 2 hours ago," Cassandra continued, pulling a transcript from the clerk's desk, "you testified under oath. Do you recall your statements?" Kane's lips moved, but no sound came. "Allow me to refresh your memory," she read aloud, voice cutting like glass. "These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. Your word, is that accurate?" Silence. She set the transcript aside and reached beneath the bench. A tablet flickered to life in her hands. "Let us examine the evidence." Gasps rippled as the first video played. Security footage from camera 7 at the courthouse entrance. High definition, undeniable. There she was, Cassandra, walking calmly, briefcase in hand. And there was Kane, stepping from the shadows, blocking her path, spewing venom. Another welfare queen trying to sneak into places she don't belong. The slap landed, echoing in the courtroom through the speakers. The audience flinched as if struck themselves. The footage showed the papers flying. Kane's hand closing on her throat, his voice dripping hate. "Scum like you has no business in a house of justice." The gallery gasped. Some clerks covered their mouths. A paralegal rushed out in tears. "Officer Kane," Cassandra said calmly, pausing the footage at the moment his palm connected with her face. "Do you see any verbal aggression? Any threats? Any justification for this assault?" Kane's lips trembled. Still, silence. She swiped to a new file. "This is backup body camera footage, automatically uploaded to county servers every 60 seconds. A system you apparently forgot. Officer Kane." The audio filled the chamber. Kane's voice, snarling in private. "Look at this uppity woman thinking she can walk into my courthouse. Time to teach her a lesson." His own words captured beyond denial. Reynolds and Mercer shrank in their seats. Bennett looked stricken, her pen dropping from numb fingers. Cassandra's gaze cut toward the two supporting officers. "Officers Reynolds, Mercer, you swore under oath that Kane acted with professionalism and restraint. Would you like to revise your statements?" Neither answered. Both stared at the floor. "And here," she continued, advancing the footage further, "we see felony assault committed against a federal judge performing her duties. Myself." The word landed like a hammer. A ripple of disbelief surged through the gallery. Court employees who had known her for years now saw the cruel symmetry of the morning. A judge brutalized on her own steps, paraded as a criminal in her own house of justice. Cassandra set the tablet down, her robe's folds draped like shadows across the bench. Her gavel gleamed under the lights. "Officer Kane," she said, voice low but cutting, "you testified that people like me need to learn that actions have consequences. Today, you will learn precisely what those words mean." Kane's legs gave way. He collapsed into the chair beside Bennett, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The room held its breath. The balance of power had reversed so completely it felt biblical, as though the scales of justice had finally swung back with righteous fury. And Cassandra was not finished. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye fixed on Cassandra Miller as she leaned forward on the bench, robe pooling around her like black fire, gavel resting easily in her hand. "Let us review," she said, voice steady. We have sworn testimony from 3 officers, each asserting professionalism. We have their words under oath, recorded and preserved, and now we have video evidence proving the opposite. This court cannot ignore perjury when it takes place in its very chambers. She lifted the tablet again, playing a final clip, audio from Officer Mercer's body camera. Laughter, joking, Reynolds whispering, "Thinks she's actually somebody important?" Mercer replying with cruel confidence, "Nah, just another welfare case. Kane knows what he's doing." The courtroom recoiled. The ugliness was naked now, beyond spin, beyond excuse. Cassandra let the clip end. Her gaze swept across the chamber, landing on each conspirator. This was not law enforcement. This was criminal conspiracy under color of law. This was a coordinated attack on the very justice system you swore to uphold. Reynolds shifted in his chair. Mercer buried his face in his hands. Bennett stared at her own case file as though it were a noose tightening. Kane looked like a man already standing in a prison cell. Cassandra straightened. "Officer Richard Kane, based on the evidence, I find you guilty of felony assault in the first degree." Gasps rippled. "I find you guilty of assaulting a federal judicial officer, which carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years. Kane's face collapsed, color draining to gray. She continued, each word a hammer blow. "I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, punishable by up to life imprisonment when accompanied by kidnapping and assault. And I find you guilty of perjury for false testimony under oath in this courtroom." Kane trembled, tears threatening, lips moving in silent pleas. Cassandra did not flinch. "Officers Reynolds and Mercer," she turned sharply, "you too are guilty of perjury and conspiracy. Your willingness to corroborate lies makes you complicit in every violation committed here today. You will face federal indictment." Bennett opened her mouth, desperate. "Your Honor, Cassandra cut her off. "Prosecutor Bennett, your complicity in accepting fabricated evidence without scrutiny will be reviewed by the Department of Justice. Your conduct today has eroded the very foundation of prosecutorial integrity." Bennett sat back, pale and speechless. Cassandra turned to the gallery. Her voice rose, filling every inch of the chamber. "For too long, this nation has allowed officers to hide behind badges while brutalizing those they swore to protect. For too long, courts have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, silenced victims. That ends here. Justice is not blind to the truth. She sees all." Her gavel rose high. "Officer Richard Kane, you are hereby sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down with a thunderous crack that reverberated like a gunshot through the marble walls. The sound was final, absolute. The gallery erupted. Applause, gasps, shouts of vindication. Some wept openly. Clerks hugged each other, tears streaking down faces. For 5 long minutes, the room was chaos, but Cassandra sat unmoving, robe draped, eyes locked on the broken figure of Kane slumped in his chair. He sobbed uncontrollably, whispering, "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I never meant—" Her gaze cut through him. "Your remorse arrives too late. Every victim you mocked, every life you shattered deserved this justice long before today. You are not sorry for your actions. You are sorry you finally faced consequences." The gavel struck again, silencing the room. "This court stands adjourned." The words rang like scripture. Kane was led away in chains, head bowed, uniform rumpled, his career and freedom crumbling into dust. Reynolds and Mercer followed, their faces blank masks of dread. Bennett remained frozen at the table, staring into the void of her own ruined reputation. Cassandra rose, the bruise on her face now a badge of resilience, her robe trailing behind her as she left the bench. Justice had spoken, and it had spoken with thunder. 6 months later, the courthouse stood the same in stone and steel, but its nameplate gleamed with new letters. Justice Miller Federal Courthouse. A bronze plaque at the entrance bore an inscription, Here, justice found her voice. Visitors paused to read it, whispering the story to each other. How a federal judge had been assaulted on her own steps. How she turned the tables in front of a packed courtroom. How the system had been forced to reckon with itself. Richard Kane was gone, serving 35 years in a federal penitentiary. Reynolds and Mercer had pleaded guilty to conspiracy and perjury, stripped of badges, facing long terms themselves. Prosecutor Bennett resigned in disgrace, under investigation by the DOJ. But the impact reached far beyond individual punishments. Every officer in the state now wore a body camera with tamper-proof cloud backups. Every courthouse reinforced policies for transparency and accountability. Federal monitors oversaw Kane's former department, combing through years of misconduct. Most importantly, ordinary citizens, people who once believed their complaints would never matter, now stepped forward. Cases once dismissed as unsubstantiated were reopened. Families who had carried silent grief finally saw their stories taken seriously. Judge Cassandra Miller became more than a jurist. She became a symbol. Her courage, her composure under humiliation, and her thunderous reversal had lit a fire that spread nationwide. Law schools dissected the case. Civil rights groups held up her name in rallies. Even children on field trips pointed to her plaque and whispered, "That's the judge who stood up to them." On a crisp autumn afternoon, Cassandra walked those same marble steps once more. No robe, no gavel, just herself, carrying the same leather briefcase. Citizens nodded respectfully as she passed. Some clapped softly. A mother tugged her son's sleeve and whispered, "That's her, the judge who changed everything." Cassandra didn't pause for praise. She simply climbed the steps with the same steady pace she always had. But inside, she felt the weight had shifted. Justice was heavier now, but also clearer, more undeniable. The bruise Kane left on her face was long gone, but in its place remained something permanent. The mark of survival turned into legacy. At the dedication ceremony, Chief Judge Eleanor Brooks addressed the crowd. What happened here proved that no one is above the law. Not officers, not prosecutors, not even judges. Justice is blind, but she sees all, and she saw clearly on that morning. The applause swelled. Cassandra stood quietly, eyes steady, robe draped over her arm. She raised her gavel once more, not to condemn, but to honor. The engraved words caught the sunlight, burning like scripture. Her voice, measured and resolute, carried across the plaza. Justice belongs to everyone. Never forget that. The crowd erupted in cheers.